Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudranarayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with the Indian Institute of Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. I welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Maria Russo, and participants across the globe through Facebook and the YouTube Live, and who are here to listen to Professor Maria. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to our respected patrons, Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Nayak, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Professor Dr. Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Professor Dr. Sarath Kumar Pallita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha. The convener of this largest virtual conference are eminent Indian historian, Professor Dr. Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahiji. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with a national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID pandemic. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best. Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with the potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D and E3. 3D stand for debate, dialogue, and discussion, and E3 for expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focuses on marginalized communities and works for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomena for the societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoids paradoxical frameworks which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The card sincerely believe in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and builds new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps, to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities. The beneficiaries direct in self-reflecting global self-society. Ladies and gentlemen, dear researchers, faculties, and participants, in this evening, we have with us Professor Maria Russo. Dr. Russo is a lecturer in moral philosophy at Vita Salute San Raffaele University, Milan, from Italy, and a visiting fellow at the University of West of England, Bristol, United Kingdom. She teaches media ethics and film and philosophy, and also a member of the International Research Center for European Culture and Politics. Professor Maria's PhD was about the Jean-Paul Sartre's attempts to elaborate on existentialist ethics, and the major part of her publications are books and international articles on this topic. So without taking much time, I would like to invite Dr. Maria. Dr. Maria will be deliver her talk on the topic, is a different architecture of social media's platform desirable? So now I would like to invite Dr. Maria Russo to initiate her talk.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation. Can you hear and see me properly?
Please, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, I will also share my screen in order to show my PowerPoint. So I please ask you if you can tell me if you can see.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Perfect.
It's visible.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here and to share with you my my reflections. I apologize for my voice, but I'm a little bit sick, as you can hear. But I hope that the talk will be clear. And as you have kindly said, I will talk about these. This paper, the title is a different architecture of social media's platforms desirable? And the subtitle is Distributed Responsibility and the Digital World. I think that the context in which the internet was born offers some important keys to understanding the ambiguity of this new dimension of our lives. It would be, in fact, be too reductive to speak of a new means of mass communication. As you know, internet was conceived at the beginning of the 60s as a project of the US Ministry of Defense, ARPANET. A few years later, the internet materialized as a network between computers of American universities until it reached the World Wide Web in 1989. Born in the cramped space of the Cold War, however, the internet grew in the context of the need for greater openness towards a wider world, which for the first time configured its map without borders. So just think of John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which he wrote in 1996. He says, quote, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. So I address you with no greater authority than that with which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. And he concluded by saying, we will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more human and fair than the world you governments have made before. End of quote. And as early as the 80s, a real hacker ethic developed in the internet world, interpreting the internet as a free space where knowledge and skills could be shared beyond market logic and political boundaries. The year before Barlow's declaration, the programmer Ward Cunningham contrasted the concept of copyleft with that of copyright, which is also the basis of Wikipedia's wiki. And 10 years before that, Richard Stallman, a well-known hacker at MIT, wrote the new manifesto, which stands for General Public License. And he said, I consider that the golden rules requires that if I like a program, I must share it with other people who like it. Software sellers want to divide the users and conquer them, making each user not to share with others. I refuse to break solidarity with other users in this way, end of quote. And in the same vein, a professor of law in Stanford, Lawrence Lessig, constituted the Creative Commons organization for the management of free contents, and the software engineer Linus Torvalds programmed a completely free operating system named Linux. So for cyber utopians, the internet seemed to be an opportunity to embody that good place, which is also a no place. Utopic cities in the 16th and 17th centuries constituted, at least in the texts of Thomas More, Tommaso Campanella, and Francis Bacon, an alternative to a reality marked by distortions, inequalities, and limitations of freedom. And similarly, the internet seemed to be the anarchic state without borders that could really oppose a capitalism that already in those years increasingly dominated the entire planet as a way of life, not only economic. And even beyond the Iron Curtain, it's not by chance that the Berlin Wall would fall in the same year as the inauguration of the World Wide Web. To the point that authors such as Francis Fukuyama, taking up the Hegelian framework, announced the end of history, crystallized in the form of a triumphant liberal democracy. Yet this is only one of the possible identities of the internet. There is in fact another story, which is now the dominant one, that interprets the internet as the most resource-rich colonial space in human history, a place that, by virtue of its infinite virtual extension, is an excellent breeding ground for new forms of brutal capitalism. Indeed, it must be admitted that the ambitions and promises of the cyber utopians were overly abstract. In fact, in my opinion, it's not possible to conceive of a totally anarchic universe devoid of any legislation without considering the capitalist power relations of the real world, which have always been profit-oriented. What would have been needed and what is still needed is an ability to mediate between powers in the digital world that takes into account other ends, other aims beside economic ones. So paradoxically, the net space that was supposed to be without rules for its users has become a kind of Wild West for an economic system that does not have to respond to the balance of any market regulation, and where the invisible hand, far from guaranteeing a spin-off of a collective well-being, in its lack of transparency, constitutes new monopolies that are very, very difficult to break. And this type of dynamic is also part of the broader context of the neoliberal turn, which since the 70s has reduced forms of market regulation and of welfare state. Far from being an alternative dimension to reality, the digital has reproduced the same mechanisms with the greater ease and expansion. We need only quote these two citations to understand how easily the digital conquest was able to impose itself on a world that was totally unprepared to understand the speed of development and the potential of cyberspace. Eric Schmidt, who was CEO of Google, and Jared Cohen, who works for the same company, said, "The online world is not truly bound by terrestrial laws. It's the world's largest ungoverned space." And similarly, the ex-CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, said, "High-tech runs 3 times faster than normal businesses, and the government runs 3 times lower than normal businesses. So we have a 9 times gap. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that the government does not get in the way and slow things down," end of quote. So this twisting of the net from no one's space and everyone's space to the Wild West of the most ruthless capitalism has obviously not happened explicitly, but on the contrary, within the very narrative of the net as the promised land of new freedoms. As you can imagine, certainly Facebook does not present itself as a company that is in the business of selling the most predictive data possible to advertisers, whether they are trading clothing or seeking votes during an election campaign, in order to make unimaginable profits based on clickbait, increasingly compulsive consumption, and the manipulation of preferences and consensus. Indeed, instead, Facebook describes itself as a social revolution, allowing people to stay in touch, to see what is going on in their lives, to participate, actively participate in their successes and failures, and also to stay informed about what is happening in the world in real time. And all these in an order of display based on one's preferences, because the algorithms knows how to manage the newsfeed of each individual user so as to show him or her the most interesting news first. It's the prophecy that Nicolas Negroponte made from MIT in 1995. One day there would be no need to buy a newspaper or turn on the television to follow the evening news, because everyone would be able to put together a sort of daily me, a hyper-personalized information package that allows one to follow only what really interests them and to listen only to opinions with which they already agree without risking coming across a point of view that they despise or find uninspiring. So in Facebook's storytelling, Zuckerberg clearly sidesteps what his company's core business is, keeping his business model totally opaque, and instead proposes this very powerful narrative based on the freedom to express oneself and to learn, which seems to echo the first promises of the internet, because we have to recognize that, after all, Facebook is also free and based on the culture of sharing. It's no coincidence that after Cambridge Analytica and other scandals involving his company, Zuckerberg wisely decided to change its name from Facebook to Meta with a new tail load of promises of innovation and progress, with an enthusiasm comparable to that of the philosophy of positivist history in the 19th century. Shoshana Zuboff, in her famous The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, reveals in great detail how the cycle of exploitation and alienation in the capitalism of the new digital giants, including Google and Facebook, changes from that described by Marx at the dawn of industrial society. Consumers here become the fundamental source of surplus, thanks to total access to their data, which are considered the planet's new resource, more profitable than oil today. While customers are the companies that compete in the so-called market of future behavior. Zuboff sees the traits of a new dystopia behind the utopian narrative of these private companies. And she writes, quote, surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. Although some of these data are applied to product or service improvement, the rest are declared as a proprietary behavioral surplus, fed into advanced manufacturing processes known as machine intelligence, and fabricated into prediction products that anticipate what you will do now, soon, and later. Finally, these prediction products are traded in a new kind of marketplace for behavioral predictions that I call behavioral futures markets. Surveillance capitalists have grown immensely wealthy from these trading operations, for many companies are eager to lay bets on our future behavior, end of quote. And of course, as we can see in this slide, the best way to predict behavior and thus sell the certainty of a political vote or economic transaction is to directly cause it. So we move from a competition based on the quantity of data and metadata to one that also includes the quality of the data itself. Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, admits, and I'm quoting her, "We have better information than anyone else. We know gender, age, location, and its real data, as opposed to the stuff other people infer, end of quote. So as Zuboff points out, there is thus a shift from the imperative of data mining to that of data prediction, and consequently from economies of scale to economies of scope and economies of action. By these, one does not at all want to tread the slippery slope of conspiracy theories. There is no coordinated intention to impose a certain ideology, as in the fascist regimes of the 20th century. In this context, I think that the content is totally indifferent. The only logic in action is that of profit for the so-called surveillance capitalists and their shareholders. And in this context, the production of goods and services is simply a side effect, as paradoxically is technological innovation itself, even if it is presented as the ultimate goal. And although the emphasis has been placed on revolutionary technologies, the digital giants who are monopolizing a market characterized by a fierce competition between a few, so the aforementioned Google and Facebook, but also Amazon and Microsoft, are in fact living off their profits, having been the first to understand the potential of the big data market. And the hypothesis I want to put forward here is that we are not far from Thomas Piketty's description in The Capital in the 21st Century as summarized here. Quote, "From the laws of capitalism comes what Piketty calls fundamental inequality or fundamental contradiction of capitalism, according to which the gross rate of return on capital generally exceeds growth. In the long run, capitalism is a hereditary system. Its true nature is patrimonial. Income is the winning element of the system. Thus, and this is the key formula of Piketty's text, the past divorces the future. Capital, according to this concept, is ultimately reduced to rent, and which has political power in the sense that it shuts down the future, making its reopening problematic." End of quote. So Meta's future is in continuity with the past, in which Zuckerberg was able to be the first to arrive in a new colony and without the risk of running into an accusation of human rights violations, since in what sense data falls under the latter is still unclear in the public debate. So we can ask ourselves, is the right to privacy a fundamental human right, and the right to be forgotten, and so on. On this point, one cannot but agree with Zuboff. People didn't realize what was happening. In fact, after the dot-com bubble burst, small Silicon Valley high-tech startups had to radically revise their business models, because the development of new technologies as goods and services did not generate enough profit to attract new shareholders or to keep those who had bet on the initial enthusiasm. Google found itself in the position of deciding whether to start offering paid services to users, a risky move because, of course, it could clearly lose them, or to focus all its efforts on advertising, which seemed to be a promising and growing market. In fact, with the 2003 patent generating users information for use in targeted advertising, databases started to be used not only to improve Google's own service, especially to preserve the quality of its search engine, but also to make advertising more profitable for paid advertisers. And as I have already mentioned, there is no conspiracy here. Users are very happy to have access and free services. And if the price to pay is their privacy, they can also say, I have nothing to hide. In fact, we have to take into account that in a sort of vicious circle, the net and especially social media have also transformed our conception of privacy, exposure, and visibility. As Zygmunt Bauman lucidly summarizes, if never being alone and always being watched was at the heart of the old panoptic nightmare, today it's a hope, because it means not being abandoned, ignored, excluded, or even rejected. As another philosopher, Michel Foucault, analyzed, power cannot only be described in repressive terms. It still has these characteristics in some parts of the planet, and it was certainly so at the time of the fascist and communist regimes. And this is the type of power that has been criticized by the early exponents of the Frankfurt School, such as Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse. However, power does not only act to censor and repress, but also to produce pleasure and knowledge. And this insight from Foucault, which explains why people accept disciplinary instructions without being necessarily masochistic or having introjected an acceptable superego, provides comprehension into why users of the virtual state of the net are willing to surrender what are belittled as digital scraps or digital crumbs. In fact, neoliberal digital power plays precisely on the promise of enabling its users to attain new forms of pleasure and knowledge, while at the same time ensuring their total autonomy and never making explicit the real heterodirection of their preferences and needs. The key point is that while the benefits of using these new technologies are very clear, so the pleasure and knowledge that are promised and produced, it's not explicit what the price to be paid is really, so the specific form of oppression and alienation. And the picture we have described of the main contemporary digital landscape confronts individuals and institutions with a series of new ethical challenges that are certainly not made unambiguous when talking about the network and social media. And in this presentation, I will leave aside the issue of the influence of the use of social media on the individual psychology of the users, which is an increasingly pressing problem, especially with regard to the younger generations. A 2012 survey conducted in the United States reported that young adults spend more time using social media than in any other daily activity. Around 40% of the 18-29 age group claim to be online almost constantly, and a high percentage of the very young admit to feeling obliged to build a sort of personal brand on social networks. So one has to create the best possible image to be taken into account in society and in the world of work, from Facebook to LinkedIn. And the problem is that young people are at the same time the most psychologically vulnerable group, with their traditional needs for recognition, acceptance, belonging, and inclusion, and also the most exposed group to compulsive use of social media. A new pathology has also been identified under the acronym of FOMO, fear of missing out, which is a kind of fear of missing out something, a form of social anxiety resulting from the feeling that other people are always doing something more relevant or admirable in a continuous competition on each other's profiles. However, the risks are not limited to heightened performance anxieties and social confrontations, but endanger the very health of democracies. Kastanstein, an American law professor known for his idea of libertarian paternalism, asks this question: what kind of citizen can one become in a system of perfect information filtering? Without going as far as Negroponte's Daily Me, one must remember that the architecture of social media's platforms ensures that the individual user gets in touch with what interests them most and with like-minded people, without getting lost in the vast ocean of information that the network offers. And like Zuboff, Sunstein also sees the dystopian traits behind this utopia. And he writes, quote, "If citizens are inert, freedom itself is at risk. If people are constructing a daily me that is restricted to sports or the personal lives of celebrities, they are not operating in the way that citizenship requires. This doesn't mean that people have to be thinking about public affairs almost or even much of the time. But it does mean that each of us has rights and duties as citizens, not simply as consumers. As we will see, active citizen engagement is necessary to promote not only democracy, but social well-being too. And in the modern era, one of the most pressing obligations of a citizenry that is not inert is to ensure that deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. For this to happen, it's indispensable to ensure that the system of communications promotes democratic goals. Achievement of those goals empathically requires both unchosen exposures and shared experiences." End of quote. So merely coming across points of view that one already shares or information in which one is interested because of political affinities or previous curiosities certainly guarantees many clicks on Facebook, but it does not give citizens the opportunity to come into contact with alternative opinions that might change their position or with particularly relevant news that they would not seek out. However, a healthy democracy is based on the mediated confrontation of a plurality of ideas. If we believe in diversity as a value and in the richness of encounters made possible by the multiculturalism of our globalized societies, we should also encourage moments of exchange and discussion. And Sunstein stresses the importance of imagining a network that could constitute a new public space, albeit a virtual one, a modern agora in which to organize a debate that is as broad and inclusive as possible. However, still remaining within the metaphorical framework of urban space, social media, instead of constituting a new and open public space, are a set of allays, very often closed and blind. And these closed spaces are defined as echo chambers, so places where one can only hear the echo of one's own voice, in the sense that there is no possibility of confronting those who have an opinion different from one's own. And moreover, several studies reported by Sunstein himself have shown that echo chambers are responsible for two phenomena that are particularly dangerous for democracy. The fragmentation of society, on one hand, since everyone is placed in a specific target in the segment of an audience defined by certain sociopolitical characteristics, and the progressive polarization of users, on the other hand. Indeed, if a person is only exposed to a certain type of idea, they will tend to believe exactly what they believed before, but with greater conviction, feeling more entitled to take an increasingly radical position. Think of the recent pandemic crisis and health emergency. In the Italian debate, in the debate of my country, there has been a growing polarization between two camps, two groups: those who are in favor of vaccines and emergency containment devices, such as the Green Pass, and those who consider the vaccine unsafe or dangerous, or even the result of some big pharma plot, and the Green Pass, an absolutely unconstitutional tool designed solely to violate the freedom of citizens and establish a society of total control. And regardless of the reasonableness of the content of the arguments most frequently put forward by both sides, it's increasingly difficult to contain the social conflict in terms of a peaceful and mediated confrontation. From a certain point of view, it is as if these groups give different meanings to the same words such as freedom, security, rights, and duties. And these two factions only tend to inform each other in their respective information bubbles. In the case of the vaccine and Green Pass supporters, to avoid fake news and conspiracy theories. In the second, out of total distrust of institutions, the media, and even the experts themselves. So confrontation is practically non-existent because it's based on the mutual disavowal of the other as a possible interlocutor. So the paradoxical effect is that the network, and in particular social media, which were supposed to connect different people with dissimilar geographical and cultural backgrounds, are actually architected in such a way as to group only similar people who are exclusively exposed to a certain type of topics, questions, and answers. And so the illusory open space of social networks is actually a closed database of market segments. And of course, the pervasive spread of fake news further complicates the scenario, because if users only inform themselves within their own bubble, fake news have only to be in line with the dominant narrative and ideology, and they will immediately be believed to be true and will be shared with extreme visibility without being questioned and without any verification of sources. And the importance of storytelling and spectacularization of information typical of this type of content has been highlighted by an important research of the 2018 conducted by Vosoghi, Roy, and Naral, published in Science under the title of The Spread of True and False News Online. And this studies shows that fake news spreads 6 times faster on Twitter than real news, and is 70% more likely to be shared due to its spectacularity and consequent ability to attract clicks and interest. And this is how Cambridge Analytica won the votes of people who had not participated in the last political elections, whether in the case of Brexit or the election of President Trump. It was enough to understand the prevailing emotions in the population a few years after the disastrous financial crisis of 2008, which drastically affected the world economy and reduced the social divide, destroying the chances of development and social lift of the middle class. It was quite easy to see that these emotions were fear and anger. And the next step was to find out what the object of these emotions was. Fear of what? Anger towards whom? In a collective ability to understand the complex dynamics that lead to periodic crises of capitalism, the so-called establishment members were pointed to as the culprits in a very vague way on the one hand, and on the other, in a much more specific way, migrants and refugees who might have taken more resources away from the British and American people. All it took was the production of immigration-related fake news to divert votes to Leave and to one of the least credible Republican candidates in the history of the US presidential election, and who in turn made strategic use of fake news to the point that, as you remember, he was blacked out on live television and his Twitter account was temporarily blocked. This is because, thanks to social media algorithms, it's very easy to understand the psychologies of social groups, their fears and desires. In a 2015 study, computer-based personality judgments are more accurate than those made by humans. Yu, Kosinski, and Stilwell already wrote that knowing what a subject has liked 10 times makes it possible to obtain a personality profile comparable to that drawn up by a work colleague, 70 likes to that drawn up by a close friend or partner, 150 by a family member, 300 by a spouse. So this incredible predictive capacity of the algorithms and architecture of social media platforms leads to a disparity of power and knowledge that is perhaps unprecedented in the history of Western thought. While the digital giants know everything about their users to the point of being able to simulate the degree of knowledge of a family member, their users know absolutely nothing about these surveillance capitalists, about what their policies are, what their aims are, and what ethical limits, if any, they adopt in managing their platforms. And faced with such a complex and seemingly impossible to change scenario, it's at this point necessary to ask who is really responsible for such an architecture of platforms and who consequently should intervene to mitigate their most dangerous social effects on the functioning of democracy. And to simplify, we can say that the three actors that are involved in the physiognomy of the social media architecture are the national states, the private companies that own the platforms, and the users of these platforms. And it's rather easy to understand the involvement of private companies. Here, responsibility refers to legal accountability and the concrete possibility to intervene in the programming of the platforms. And apparently, only private companies seem to be responsible for how platforms are built. And this is because states do not have adequate legislative instruments to regulate cyberspace, and individual users very often feel like passive consumers without any power. And the situation, if you think about that, is even more paradoxical. If one considers that the owners of the platforms rather try to lighten their load of responsibility. For instance, by not adopting editorial policies claiming that only users publish contents. Zuckerberg does not hold himself responsible for what is published on Facebook, even if in the last period, algorithms have indeed been used to intercept, for example, inappropriate images, but child pornography as well as paintings by well-known artists are removed, and sometimes even fake news. As Honora O'Neill points out, unsurprisingly, these new intermediaries can ignore established ethical and epistemic norms and standards, and can disperse activity and limit their own accountability. They may circulate fake, false, and flaky content, enabling their customers to exercise covert influence. Today, we can look back on the cyber romantic fantasy that this intermediation would foster democracy with amusement tinged with bitterness. But it's hard to identify remedies, end of quote. The point is that there is no institution independent of Facebook that evaluates Facebook's choices. Zuboff explains the same mechanism for Google. The ethics committees are internal to the companies themselves, or are very often composed of researchers who are directly funded by the company they are supposed to evaluate. So to sum up, two levels of responsibility have to be taken into account here as far as platforms owners are concerned. The so-called editorial responsibility, of which O'Neill referred in the previous paragraph, and the responsibility for the architecture of the platform themselves. If both were to be accepted as fully justified, social media would have to become much more like the editorial staff of a newspaper or a TV channel, with a hierarchy of precise roles and the need to respect certain ethical and epistemic standards, including fact-checking. However, one could reply that this is not the spirit of Facebook, also because one could certainly think of a drift that could come close to censorship. Who should decide which contents to publish and on what basis? Should the posts of private citizens be screened by experts, and experts on what exactly? But the second level of responsibility is different. A platform that rewards invisibility contents that are relevant from a collective point of view and therefore concern ethical, social, and political issues, and that come from information sources with a certain credibility, is very different from a platform that rewards in visibility the news that attracts the most clicks. So starting from the very architecture of the platform, whose aiming is, in the first case, free quality information, and in second case, the most certain profit possible, we can see that they promote two different typologies of virtual marketplaces, users, and trend topics. Even if social media want to claim their position as a free platform for the publication of individual contents, it's impossible not to take this last observation into account. In this case, responsibility is not so much that of the efficient causes. Could we say that Zuckerberg is guilty of a post using hate speech, for instance, as of the final causes? Could we say that Zuckerberg is guilty of rewarding a post that gains a lot of visibility because it uses hate speech? So if one doesn't want to get to the level of editorial responsibility, one can certainly reject that the architecture of the platform is primarily aimed at the market of clicks and data. Still sticking to this concept of responsibility based on final causes, one could accept the extraction and use of data for social purposes, for example, tracking contagions during a pandemic without disturbing the ghost of bizarre health dictatorship, or in any case with a view at improving a product or a service, while it's not possible to accept the extraction and use of user data for the sole purpose of enriching aggressive competitors in the market for future behavior, Facebook itself and all its advertisers. The point is always the purpose for which both technological devices and the raw material of these devices, data and metadata, are used. And it's on this purpose that both states and users should intervene. Now, the problem of state intervention is quite complex. First of all, there is no internet state, and therefore platforms enter the online space of various countries with different political regimes and social and cultural traditions. If each individual state were allowed to intervene to regulate social media, it would first of all create incredible disparities between democratic and authoritarian regime. And in part, this is already happening as some states have created their own digital universe, such as China, which has, for example, replaced Google with Baidu, and is increasingly being taken as an example by other countries that combine technological innovation with authoritarian political regime. Moreover, this immediately brings to mind the nightmare of the use of censorship and control over the media that was characteristic of the 20th century fascism. That a state institution can control contents on social media is obviously a risk in guaranteeing users' freedom of expression, also because the current architecture of platforms could be used to reward not so much contents that guarantees more clicks, but only contents that is consistent with a certain ideology that the government wants to force people to share. So I think that a more promising route from the point of view of guaranteeing neutrality in the control of platform policies would seem to be rather a form of collaboration between states on the minimum moral and epistemic standards that platforms should respect. And finally, there are the users, who certainly cannot be content to be relegated to a passive position. So they simply consent, without reading, of course, to long and complex forms on the transfer of their data and privacy. Timothy Garton-Ash reminds us how much power consumers have on their side, being the raw material of this new resource extraction mine. In the metaphor he uses in his book titled Freedom of Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, state power is likened to a big dog, private superpowers to cats, and individual users to mice. And yet he says, with an effective play on words, we the mice vote with our mouse. So just as the cruelties of early industrial capitalism were fought through instruments of civil disobedience, such as strikes and demonstrations, there is a way to refuse to work also in cyberspace. So work corresponds to give up the data that constitute the surplus. So, for example, silence on the part of millions of users to challenge a specific policy or irresponsible behavior by Facebook can force the company's management to take into account the protests and requests of users. But there is also a broader responsibility that concerns users of social media and the web in general. It's the responsibility to try to make the net a better place than it is, and this can happen beyond any fact-checking or legitimate censorship of dangerous hate speech. It's the ability to generate winning counter-discourses that can be more credible and effective than those based on hatred, fear, anger, in echo chambers full of fake news. And these could be counter discourses that do not aim at greater polarization and fragmentation of society, but at promoting inclusiveness and bringing the debate back onto the tracks of a respectful and democratic confrontation. This is the responsibility of every user who writes a post, comments on it, and shares it. Indeed, from my point of view, this should be the starting point for rethinking what the web should and could be. And I'm going to conclude my presentation with this part. So the first step to take the change, to change the current architecture of the platforms is therefore to recognize oneself as responsible for it, even if you are just a user. The second step is to oppose the determinist vision that is part of the surveillance capitalist storytelling, namely that, to paraphrase Leibniz, this is the best of all possible architectures, and that it's the technologies themselves that imply certain practices. This illusory inevitability of technological development is rhetorically used as a shield to prevent people from thinking about concrete alternatives. As Zuboff reminds, quote, surveillance capitalism is a market form that is unimaginable outside the digital milieu, but it's not the same as the digital. It's capitalism that assigns the price tag of subjugation and helplessness, not the technology. That surveillance capitalism is a logic in action and not a technology is a vital point, because surveillance capitalists want us to think that their practices are inevitable expressions of the technologies they employ. End of quote. So the architecture of technological device depends, as already mentioned, on the purposes for which they are used. It's not the drone that modifies the experiences of war by creating a distance between soldiers and targets and a consequent adiaphorization, but it's the aim of making war a less traumatic and emotionally involving experience that creates a technology that allows for remote combat. It's not social media technology that dictates the extraction and sale of the data, but it's this goal that has driven the structuring of social media as users know them today. So one must therefore ask to what extent it's possible to interfere in the architecture of these platforms, which are private initiatives. Whether they collaborate with the various intelligence agencies is another matter. And there are those who go so far as to propose, like Nick Znicek or Christian Fuchs, a real collectivization of platforms in the direction of a radical platform socialism. For example, we can see that in this quote: rather than just regulating corporate platforms, efforts could be made to create public platforms, platforms owned and controlled by the people. More radically, we can push for post-capitalist platforms that make use of the data collected by these platforms in order to distribute resources, enable democratic participation, and generate further technological development. Perhaps today we must collectivize the platforms, end of quote. And this would mean a drastic intervention in the entire capitalist economic system, given the importance of the financial and digital sectors. It would leave open also the question of how these platforms could be operated publicly without the organs of state power taking advantage of them, which is another dangerous dystopia. More modestly, virtuous initiatives can be proposed to exploit the architecture of the platforms to really achieve more participatory forms of democracy. The point is to ensure that genuine social impacts are included as a priority in their design. For example, Sandra Matz of Columbia University in 2017 wrote, in Psychological Targeting as an Effective Approach to Digital Mass Persuasion, on the one hand, this form of mass psychological persuasion could be used to help people make better decisions and lead healthier and happier lives. On the other hand, it could be used to secretly exploit weaknesses in their character, highlighting the potential need for political intervention, end of quote. So in the wake of Sunstein's libertarian paternalism, one could think of nudges aimed at correcting users' cognitive biases, prejudices, and stereotypes to ensure more informed and critical information. For example, if one clicks on a piece of news that appears to be fake news, the platform could point the user to a series of scientific articles that counteract the uninformative content, and this without resorting to any form of censorship. Once again, it's a question of encouraging counter discourses, scientific against pseudoscience, and ethical against hate speech. But differently from the current situation, these contents have to be rewarded in visibility and sharing by virtue of their objective relevance, and not of the possible number of clicks. This should be regulated at an international level in the name of protecting democratic debate and a market not characterized by unassailable monopolies. So before arriving at the proposal for the collectivization of platforms, Nietzsche points out some actions that can be taken right away. The state, by contrast, has the power to control platforms. Antitrust cases can break up monopolies, local regulations can impede or even ban exploitative lean platforms, government agencies can impose new privacy controls, and coordinated action on tax avoidance can draw capital back into public hands, end of quote. And Fuchs also insisted on the need to set up an appropriate taxation system for the digital giants, which would affect all the countries whose citizens connect to the platforms. For example, one could think of progressive taxation based on the clicks that are obtained on content that has an advertising associated with it, that is managed in the country of reference, so where the user who clicked on the content is located. And this would be an effective way to redistribute at public level pockets of wealth that would otherwise only remain in the hands of a few and on the basis of an unpaid exploitation of citizens' data. Secondly, effective antitrust laws could prevent wild takeovers of small high-tech companies to rebalance the market and ensure access to new digital players. As already mentioned, the interference of a single government is not enough, but international, if not global agreements on a fair and democratic management of cyberspace would be needed, with autonomous institutions in charge of assessing the ethical standards of the platforms themselves. Zuboff, at the end of her book, proposes the convincing idea of establishing a sort of FDA for algorithms, and initiatives such as the European Union's AI for People go precisely in the direction of providing tools for the critical analysis of algorithms in order to make them ethical and transparent. And to achieve such results, it will also be necessary to raise the awareness of the user population on these issues with digital literacy courses that can effectively train the new generations and attempt to reduce the unresolved problem of the digital divide, both between generations and between developed and developing countries. And I think that these initiatives would be a first step to erode from within the rent-based capitalism that manages to anchor tomorrow's production to yesterday's in order to reopen the door to the future, or rather to possible alternative futures, as we were promised. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Maria, you and although you
I'm not able to hear you properly. I'm sorry. Can you repeat, please?
Are you here? I would like to invite Dr. Nupur Patnaik for go for a quick comment, please.
Hello, am I clearly audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yeah. A very good afternoon and good evening. So I would like to thank Professor Maria Russo, who came all the way from Italy to deliver her talk virtually. Is a different architecture of social media's platform desirable? So I would like to thank you, ma'am, that you made the discussion very engaging and very enlightening too, to understand, because this is a very real problem that goes on today. The social media has been showing lots of news and people are highly influenced by that, and we always owe everything to the social media. Like whatever in the media we see, we accept it without filtering it. So the filtration process that you have described about, the filtering the things that needs to be done, and that is not done, and usually people believe in the things that come to them. And another thing you have also described about the kind of polarization that social media creates, the divide that social media creates, because people in COVID times also, we usually had a lot of problem in the pandemic, as well as the pandemic continues. It isn't ended yet, but still people have a lot of issues with different aspects of life, and it was because of the social media only, because the social media tried to show something, and it was the role of the nation states, as you have said, the officials, the machinery that operates, that usually creates these gaps. And usually there is a need for a permanent solution, as you have also concluded it with a kind of solution that we require for solving the problem of the media getting more and more acceptable. But we should have a filtration process, as you say, about a different architecture that is really needed for social media, so that we could have a better society and a better understanding of human beings. So thank you so much, ma'am. It was really engaging and very much relevant in today's world.
Thank you
ma'am.
so much for your comments. You're very kind. Yes, I think that the solution is not to purely attack social media, but to truly understand how we can improve them and make them make a better architecture. Because I think that social media are also an incredible tool to communicate. For example, we can imagine a situation in which there is a political regime and the official media do not transmit the correct information, and people can use social media to inform the rest of the world about the truth and the real facts that that were happening in that moment. So, for example, people use social media in this way during Occupy Wall Street, during the Arab Spring. So I think that there are hopes and possibilities to change the architecture of social media in a better way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nupur Patnaik. And as you rightly mentioned by Dr. Nupur, Madam, really your engaging ideas with the social media and all these internet issues. When you talked about 1960, perhaps the era when digital media started in USA, then it collapsed throughout the entire journey has been witnessed by UK to Europe and then simultaneously Asia as well. You rightly mentioned about the power and knowledge system about Michael Foucault's. You talked about Piketty's idea, and you rightly mentioned the Frankfurtian school's entire journey how these people emerge his ideas in terms of this content and communities engagement. With this prioritical note, I would like to know a little bit more about the hypothesis, or you can take seriously note of assumptions. Do you believe when in a struggling phases of a political society, or those are always believing in the philosophy of public the first or public at large, when you think particular the systemize of the globalized world can through these ideas of internet or this social media, you rightly mentioned in one slide, when 70% of fake news always marketized by these media tycoons and even the knowledge producing societies, and those you rightly mentioned some of your talk about the Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica also one of the problematic coins for this world order. If you go through these elections of America, as well in India, in many terms, in particular South Asia regions, when people are almost believe in particular social media, in these days, internet is the so-called God, quote unquote, double quote unquote. Social media in terms of God. If you cannot get internet, then you can also lost your identity. What is your ideas on it?
Well, I have read also a survey in which the researcher says we have asked in some countries of the world, what do you think about internet and what do you think about Facebook? And people responded they are the same thing. So for some people in many countries, internet and Facebook are the same thing. These are not, there are no differences, and I think this is another big problem because it means that many people only go on platforms that are already famous, that have already a great number of people, and they are not able to understand the potentialities of the net because they don't have the instrument. And this is also here in Italy, there is also this kind of problem, because I think that this problem starts with the school's formation, because there are no courses dedicated to the alphabetization on the digital world. There are no courses in which young people are informed by the risks of fake news. And this is also because sometimes the same teachers are not prepared on facing these problems, because there are no formations course dedicated to that. And I think that today it's impossible to not considerate this kind of issues when you are talk about global justice or social revolution, or these kind of topics that are very important in various moments of history and in other subjects such as philosophy or other subjects. So I think that this is the main problem, that people don't have the correct instruments to understand the dark side, we can say, of the internet, and also the potentialities of the internet. I don't know if I have answered to your question, because I was not able to hear the first part. Probably I have not a very good connection.
Thank you so much, madam. And I would also ask you a little bit more in terms of this penetration theory you rightly mentioned in your first slide, and then this particular artificial intelligence and machine learning, when you just give some importance in your many other slides. And you rightly mentioned about this global citizenship and the global village concept as well. Because in this arena of internet, it should be possible through the master narration of these big players. What actually they wanted to know, they impose their ideas on us. And you rightly mentioned about we harm to our political culture. Rather, we can say rightly the political society as well. If something not properly work on this ethos of this notion and nation concept, what stink about this Habermas idea, And the hegemonical approach, the public narration is not untrustworthy. Even the government, even the cyber mafias, they rule over us. What is your ideas on it?
I was not able to understand the first part because I have a connection that always, I can see only mechanical sounds. Could you please write the question? I can see in the chat, so I'm
Okay.
able to answer. There is another question also. Okay, after I will also answer to that.
Sure. Go with chat, madam.
Okay, what are the effects of artificial intelligence implemented on social media portals? Does the new media coverage increase the objectivity of the media and information provided to the public? Yeah, I have tried to explain some of the effects of this particular use of artificial intelligence in social media. So I have tried to describe the architecture of algorithms and their consequences, of course, from an ethical point of view. So how they can intervene in the functioning of our democracy, in the sense that they can change the way in which we confront themselves, we confront to each other, and so the structure of our debates. Because I think that it's impossible today to distinguish the online world from the offline world. These two worlds are really connected. And so the public space is on the internet as is in the real space. I don't think that there is a difference today. So what I have tried to do during my presentation was to present these type of effects, and I was focused only on effects on the functioning of democracies, and as I have already mentioned, not on the psychological effects that these kind of algorithms could have on people, on single individuals. Okay, thank you. What are your ideas about global village and global citizenship concepts propagated by these cyber mafias in 21st century's world order to fill the gaps and start impose on us new colonies? Okay, perfect. Now I understand. Yeah, the idea of global village is an idea formulated for the first time by Marshall McLuhan, and I think that this is already this is still an important way to see our contemporary scenario. Timothy Garton Ash tried to actualize this definition, talking about a virtual cosmopolis, in the sense that the global village probably doesn't include in its definition also this idea of cyberspace, which is so important today. And yeah, I've used the idea of colonies and this type of word taken from colonialism, because I think that in the past century, the spaces which were more exploited and without any rules, without any regulations, were colonies. The most brutal aspect of capitalism were in colonies in Africa and also in Asia. But then in that case, the violations of human rights were very clear to all people. And in fact, there was a lot of revolution to change this scenario. But today we have this new space in which there are resources, in which people can become very rich without any regulation. But it's not so clear. It's not so clear how they violate human rights. If you consider also privacy as a human right. So they are, of course, less violent. There are no a clear oppression, such as in the old colonies. But I think that it's risky too. And we have to face it with the new instruments. Of course, legislation, as I mentioned during my presentation, is not prepared now to understand how to regulate these kind of markets. But I think that cyberspace is a colony in this sense. I don't know if I was clear in answering. Okay, your research on post-colonial life worlds, I think, finish the intuitions when we start to respond for social change campaign through online media without knowing right or wrong. Maybe there is a typo. Your research on post-colonial life worlds finish with the institution when we start to respond for social change campaign through online media without knowing right or wrong. In which sense without knowing right or wrong? You mentioned you are making, you are thinking about, okay, cause of action. Okay, so you are referring to Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring and these kind of social movements that I have mentioned at the end of my presentation, maybe. Me too. Okay, me too. Okay. Yeah, I think that also Me Too can be understood in this framework of echo chambers, in the sense that it's, I have used the example of health emergency. And I've used the example of these two different groups or of vaccine supporters and no vax in Italy. But I could use also the example of Me Too, because I think that people who believe in this kind of revendications and this kind of social actions, in a sense, stay only in different information bubbles. So people that are okay with Me Too confront with other people that are like-minded, and so the other part is not able to confront actively with the people who think differently. I think this is one of the most important problems of our times, that people that think differently are not able to find a common ground. And sometimes it seems to me that people give different meanings to the same words, as I've mentioned during my presentation, in the case of vaccines, freedom, security, rights, and duties, but also in the case of Me Too, because people from different groups can give different meanings to concepts, also in this case, like freedom, rights of women, and you know, what also men have to do to help women, what women have to do to help other women, and so on, and what we have to do to change some conditions on the workplace and things like that. I think that you can cite every kind of important phenomena of our contemporaneity, and you can describe them with this framework of echo chambers. Finally, what is your suggestion to the capital bubbles for virus to vaccination problematic world order to relax about pandemic? Okay. I don't have a real solution, of course, but I think that the first step could be to talk about how the structure of the architecture of social media platforms can change our ideas, starting from schools, starting from younger people, because of course they are the future. And there are some cases in Italy, for example, in which parents did not want to vaccinate their children, and their children accuse their parents and obtain the right to being vaccinated, because probably youngest people were able to inform themselves also outside of the bubbles information of their parents. So I think that we have to invest in youngest generations, and to say it with a slogan, we have to invest in the future. Also because the oldest people sometimes are not able to understand fake news and to recognize false news and true news. Also because they are, for the problem that I have quoted before of the digital divide, they are not able to understand the mechanisms of social media and of the net in general.
Thank you. Thank you so much, madam. Now I would like to request Snigdha madam to go for a formal vote of thanks as well.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, please. Please, please.
Good evening to all. I would like to give first vote of thanks formally to Maria Russo, who is lecturer in moral philosophy at Vita Salute San Raffaele University, Milan, Italy, for his thought-provoking and outstanding deliberation today. At the same time, we'll give my thanks to our co-host, Institution Head, Professor Sanjay Naik, Vice Chancellor, Revensa University, Cuttack, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, IIM, Sambalpur, and also Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, IC, Vice Chancellor of Central University, Odisha. At the outset, the conveners of this World Human Science and Management Conference, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda and Charudatta Panigrahi, for his dynamite of arranging such a webinar from Odisha, where intellectuals became positioning in muted all time. Last but not least, the participants whose time always praiseworthy for all of us. Thank you all. Before I conclude this section, once again, thank you. Team Card and our efforts to make it globally possible. Thank you. Thank you all the before this meeting concluded. We'll meet tomorrow with a new speaker again. We'll back in same time and venue as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation, and have a nice day.